Good morning. Oh, that's loud. How is everybody? Good. It's been a minute since I've been here. I think most of you hopefully know who I am. If you don't, my name is Michael Teller, which means I'm the son of this guy, this weird guy. But I am a ministry student at Indiana Wesleyan University. It's a good school up in Marion, Indiana, middle of nowhere. And so he's been kind enough to give me some opportunities to come here and talk to you guys, and hopefully you're not sick of me yet. I hope not. That was pretty silent. It got real quiet there. It's kind of awkward, but I guess I have to push through anyway, so. Well, today I want to talk to you guys about stories. How many of you guys like to read? Anybody? Any readers in here? Okay. I loved to read when I was a kid, which is funny because when I got into high school, I hated reading. Kind of interesting how that works. Now I think I'm finally coming back to where I actually like to read again, and so, maybe that's something with the school system. But I loved to read when I was a kid. And I read all kinds of books. I love mystery books. I read like The Boxcar Children, I think. Anybody read The Boxcar Children? Anybody? Yes. I read a lot of kids' stories. I don't really remember those. But I read Lord of the Rings. Any Lord of the Rings fans? Yes. The Hobbit. Let's go. I read all the Chronicles of Narnia. Lots of books that I haven't read in a long time now, because I stopped reading a long time ago. But yeah, so I love stories, and the cool thing about stories is that they give you kind of a world that you can jump into, you can investigate, and you can kind of like escape from your own little world, and you get to dive in and see what's going on in this other universe. And the cool thing that's really interesting about stories is that they actually teach you a lot of things. You actually learn a lot from stories. How many of you notice this, that when you read, you actually dive in and you learn a lot from the characters in the stories. In fact, most stories actually have a lot of moral principles, a lot of life lessons that you learn as you engage them. And a lot of us actually learn a lot of things about life, basic life principles from reading books. This is why you should read, right? This is also why you should read Bible stories to your kids. Kind of important. That's a free caveat, just for you, just free. But it's true, though. You actually learn a lot from stories, and that they kind of have a lot of lessons that we learn as we engage them. And as I've gotten older, what I've actually learned is that this is actually the case in more than just stories, or more than just books. This is in our movies, this is in our culture, that actually we learn a lot from these sort of narratives, these sort of stories that exist in culture. We watch Star Wars. I learned a lot from Star Wars. There's a lot of good lessons there, Watch more Star Wars. You can go home now. You're good. Watch more Star Wars. But in movies and culture, there's all sorts of different stories and narratives and things that are actually teaching us lessons and principles that we, whether or not we're aware of, are learning and are being shaped by on a regular basis. In fact, the easiest way to kind of portray this, advertising has actually picked up on this. Advertisers have learned this, that we're actually shaped more, rather than by like facts, but actually by sort of principles portrayed to us in stories that we can kind of dive into. So I'm going to give you guys a couple examples of what I mean by this, and show you how advertising has changed over the years. So if you guys want to play the first clip, So this is how advertising used to work. And it's based on facts and trying to teach you something. But the thing is, we've realized that we actually learn better through stories and through kind of engaging in a life that you can choose. So I want to play another advertisement that's more contemporary, and you'll see how this has shifted and how we think about things. But see, there's something about a story that captivates us, that we can dive in, that we can be a part of this story, that we can buy into it. And here, we've been in this series in Colossians, and we're here in chapter 1, where Paul is really trying to present to us the truth about Christ. And here we're going to start in verse 15, Colossians 1:15. And really, Paul is trying to teach us what is the story of Christ. And I think he really wants to clarify to the church here in Colossae, what is the story that we are to buy into, that these Christians here in Colossae are to buy into. And it's important, before we dive in real quick, I want to give you a little bit of background. I think Jim has covered some of this, but it's really important what's going on here, because here in their culture, there's a lot of things going on. And there's a lot of stories, there's a lot of ideas floating around in their culture that are easily being brought into kind of their Christianity. That they've heard the gospel, they've heard the good news, but there's so many different stories and ideas kind of floating around at this time that it's easy for this to kind of trickle in. And one of the main things going on is this idea called Gnosticism, and this is it's sort of the philosophy / religion of the day. It's really the common thought of the day. And it's all about this sort of secret wisdom and this sort of divinity that, like, if you can understand these secrets, then these special things of the divine goodness, and who knows, but that you can kind of buy your way into the divine nature. You can kind of achieve salvation. It's really confusing. It's really complex. But the idea is that there's this really broad philosophy that's all about getting in sync with this special wisdom, this divine knowledge that will enlighten you. And so this is really this common philosophy of the day, and it's easy that these Christians, having just heard the news of Christ, it's easy for this to start trickling into their thinking. This is also around the same time that Nero is being installed as the new emperor. And so, like any time there's a change in leadership, especially in Rome, that's a huge empire, Nero is bringing in, hey, the old emperor is gone. I'm bringing in this new message of hope. We're going to set justice right here in Rome. We're going to establish a new Roman order that's going to be greater and better than it's ever been. And so there's all sorts of different things going on in the Greco-Roman culture right now that are really fighting for the minds of these Christians here in Colossae, that's really fighting for their attention and for them to buy into, for them to put their hope in. And so Paul is writing to these Christians, and he really wants to clarify for them what it is that their hope is in, and what it is that the story that they're really meant to buy into. So I want to read here in Colossians 1:15, or we're starting in verse 15. It says, talking about Jesus, it says, "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together." So right out the gate here, Paul is saying that Jesus is not just a man. In fact, he's really not even a human person. And I know this sounds confusing at first, but what I'm saying is that he wasn't always human. See, even though that Christ came and became a human man, he's existed for all of eternity. That really his identity is that he is the eternal Son of God. Not Jesus. Jesus is his human name, yes. But even when he becomes human, he never ceases to be fully God. That he is the true image of God himself. That he's existed for all of eternity, and that he preserves all things. Through him, all things have been created. So Jesus, not just, Jesus of Nazareth, born in a manger, but before this, he was present with the Father and the Holy Spirit at creation, creating all things. So he's not only in the world, but he created the world, and since then has now come into it to be present with us. So right out the gate, he's saying Jesus is not just a man, he is divine. And then he continues, he says, he is the firstborn of all creation. This is where it gets confusing, because again, firstborn, we think, okay, born, well, was Jesus created? But that's not what Paul is saying here. Paul's actually not indicating that Christ was created, or that there was this time when he didn't exist and he was, because he just said that he's eternal. He just said that he created all things. But really what he's getting at is that so in Old Testament, there's this idea of like an eldest son. There's the birthright. I don't know if you're familiar with this at all, but what he's getting at is that Christ is the firstborn, being he has the birthright of God. So really what he's trying to say is that having now been human, Christ is the greatest among all humans. He is the most important, the most significant of all of us, and that he really is God's beloved son. See, we're God's children, but Jesus is his beloved son. He is the greatest. He is the most important in all of creation. So he's starting this framework of Jesus. We can continue here in verse 18. He says, "And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross." I know this is really wordy, kind of, this passage. It's real dense. So we're going to continue to break it down. So he's the head of the body of the church. So he's the greatest among all humans. He's also the head of the church. He's our leader. We're the church. He is the leader of the church. And then it says, he is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead. Again, another weird phrase, firstborn from the dead. What does that mean? Again, what he's paralleling this with firstborn of creation, so he's the greatest, and then firstborn among the dead. What he's really trying to clarify is that Jesus is not only the creator, he's not only the sustainer, but he is also the one who gives us new spiritual life. That Jesus, having been born again, so to say, being resurrected and glorified, he gives to us new birth. So he creates us, sustains us, and recreates us. And that's what he's trying to say, this firstborn among the dead. So we all will die, but we are recreated in Christ. So again, Paul is really presenting his argument that Christ is the greatest. And he says he is reconciled to himself all things, and he's made peace by the blood of his cross. So Christ has made us right with God through his cross. And really, Paul here is presenting all of the things that Christ has done for us. He's created us, he's recreated us, he sustains us, and he has made us right with God through the cross. So we pick up here again in verse 21. What am I saying? Here in verse 21, and it says, "And you," so there's sort of a shift. So Paul's talking about Christ and all the things he's done. And then verse 21, "And you who were once alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, he has now reconciled in his body of flesh by death, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him, if indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, became a minister." So here Paul is really saying, this is the true story. This is the good news, the gospel that I am a minister of. And it's that Christ has done it. The good news, the good story, the story of God, of Christ, is that Christ is not only the creator, but that he's the recreator, the sustainer, the one through whom all things exist, the one who gives us new life, not just physical life, but new spiritual life, and the one who has made us right with God through the cross. That from beginning to end, this is really the gospel, is that Christ has done it from beginning to end. And he says, "And you must persist in faith." And that's really his call to us, that we have to buy into this. We have to buy into this story, to put our full faith, our trust in God, and persist amidst all these other stories that compete, that fight for our attention, that fight for us to buy into them. I mean, they're getting my money. But There's all these things that are for the church in Colossae that are trying to fight for their attention, for them to buy into. And he's saying, this is the good news, the news that I have been a minister of, that Christ is the full work of salvation. And see, perceptions are really important because it's easy to get the wrong idea. It's really easy to buy into the wrong thing. I mean, it's everywhere. It's really easy to be sold on something. And Paul is really laying out not just information here. He's not just telling us, okay, here's your theology 101. This is what we have to put our stock into. Because it's really easy to buy into another story. There's a lot of convincing ideas, convincing stories, things that pull us in, a lot of thoughts. But Paul wants to make very clear to them, and also, I think, to us, that we can't just buy into anything. And I think, just like it was for them, there are a lot of ideas, there's a lot of stories, there's a lot of things to buy into in our culture today. I'll write a couple down for you. I think one is just, I apologize, I'm left-handed. My handwriting is rather sketch. Money. This is one. I mean, we hear this all the time. It's not just money, but it's doing well. You can earn things. You can make a living. You can do well. You can put your hope, put your trust in being secure, having paved the way for your family, or having your trust in your savings account and your stock, that you can really, there's a narrative that goes along with us that tells us that if we do well, we'll be satisfied. That if we do well, we'll get there. We'll be happy. That's really what life is about. It's about making it. It's about doing well, a certain level of success, having the things that we wanted. I think another one, this is a big one, I think. I actually write in all caps because I think you can read it. I think if I didn't write in all caps, you wouldn't be able to read it. Here, that's a bullet point. Pleasure. I think this is a big one in our culture. That really life is about being satisfied. It's about happiness. Finding the things that meet your needs. What meets your needs? And that's really what life is about. That you can buy into this life that it's really about being happy, about meeting your own needs, about being satisfied. And that if you do these things, that's really what's going to bring you happiness, is just doing what seems right now, what makes sense, what feels good in the moment. There's a whole world built around this idea. We see it in the news, we see it in celebrities, we see it everywhere. That really, there's this idea for us to buy into that pleasure is really what will bring you happiness and what will bring you joy. This is really what your hope is in. I think there's another big one here. This is somewhat similar, but it's just self-focus. That life is really about you, achieving your goals, getting where you've been trying to go. That this is what will really bring you satisfaction. This is really what you can put your hope in. Everybody is going to have their own thoughts on life, their own philosophy. But find what works for you. Really stick to it. Achieve your goals. Make your dreams. This is what is going to. You can put your hope in this. Is just chasing what's right for you. And there's really more than this. I'm really just giving a couple. There's national stories that America is really the hope that we have for the world. There's political stories that a certain political persuasion is it's what you can trust in, and there's so many. But My point is that this is not, there's good things in each of these. Money is not bad. Pleasure is not bad. I hope you guys don't go like cutting yourselves because pleasure is bad. That's not what it is. This one might be bad altogether. But these are not caught up in the story of Christ. And that really, I want to draw for you, really the story of Christ is of God and creation, and that he comes to be with us. Bearing with us our burdens, to save us, to give us new life through the cross. This is going to be a sketch cross. And to give us new life forever. And that really, this is the story that defines us, that defines who we are. It means that in a world that tells us that money is what's going to bring our satisfaction, that we are willing to be generous. Is not that what Christ did for us? Not just with our time, with our efforts, with those things, but we're people who are marked by Christ, who are willing to not be consumed by our money, but willing to give it up for others, willing to give up our things for others. That in a world that tells us, success, that we're willing to give up success to follow Christ, to serve the world, to serve others. That in a world that tells us that pleasure is what's good for us, that Christ went to the cross for the sake of the world, that we are to be people marked by character, by self-control. Yes, there's times when following Christ is of great pleasure, but there's times when it's difficult too. And it requires self-control. It requires character. And that we're willing to buy into this, of who Christ is and everything about him, to give up things, to give up pleasure at times, for the sake of others, for the sake of the world, and for the sake of God. And in a world that tells us that it's all about us, we see pretty clearly that God is unselfish. That if there's anything that Christ did, it's he gave it up for us. That being God himself came to earth to undergo suffering in order to show us greatest love. And that our story is not about us getting it right, about us, looking out for our own achievements, our own good. It's not bad to have goals. It's not bad. Those aren't bad things, to have good goals or to want to be, to do well. But what is it that marks your life? What is the story you've bought into? Because I'm convinced that the story of God is that he surrenders for us. And we live in a time that is often very confusing. First, to say that it's not simple. I think like this church that Paul's writing to, there's a lot of things going on. There's a lot of issues. And we live in a time when there's a lot of issues that there's not clear answers. It's not simple. And I think that if we really buy into this, I think, Paul says we persist in faith, that it's more important for us to be living this than to get all the answers right. Let me say that again. It's more important for us to be living this than to get all the answers right. Because I admit that sometimes it's hard to know all the right things. It is. It's hard to get all the answers right, to know when you've done the absolute best thing or when you've stood on the right side of an issue. But I think if there's something we learn from Christ, it's that it's more important for us to be living out these things than us to be right. And that if we are the church of which Christ is the head, that we are to reflect the image of God. That just as Jesus is the image of God, that we are the image of Christ. And that when we buy into this story, when we buy into Christ being the greatest, when we put him above us, and we follow in his footsteps, that we look different, that we're willing to be generous, we're willing to be self-sacrificing, we're willing to go out of our way for others, to be self-effacing, and to look to the interest of others. And that when we do this is where we will really have an impact. I think it's easy to want to live with our minds. I know this is very real for me. It's easy to want to think rightly about everything, to know, to correct, and to rebuke people. But I think it's much better for us to be living it, to be showing it, to be the church. And that really Paul, writing to this church, this isn't an individual focus that he's giving. That he's really teaching that Christ is not just the greatest, but he's the head of the body, the church, that we are under, and that he is supreme over us. And that it's not just you and you and you and you getting it right, it's us. How are we reflecting him? And how have we bought into this? And so, my question today for you is this. What is the story that you're buying into? What is it that we have an easy time buying into? What are the other stories that pull us away? Because I think it's easy when we're not consciously paying attention, when we're not seeking Christ and his word and pursuing him, it's easy to buy into other things. It is. What is the story that you're buying into that is pulling you away from what Christ has called you to? What is that? And is there a story that us together, is there something that we as a whole are being pulled away by that's keeping us from reflecting Christ? What is that? My second question is this. How can we embody this? How can we put Christ as supreme? How can we embody his kind of character, his kind of love together? Because I'm convinced that if we are willing to do this, if we are willing to buy into this, to go against the current of just the common thoughts, but to buy into this idea of Christ being the greatest, that we are servants, that we are self-effacing, giving things up for others, having character. That if we buy into this, how do we reflect the image of God? How do we reflect him? Pray with me today.